Right. Well, I want to start with the keto diet and then we'll get into the opposite of the keto diet, the sugar diet. Um, but why did people attach themselves to the keto diet for fat loss? Why did it work? And then why long term did it start failing people? Because it's out of favor now. And they're even, like I said, coming out with Keto 2.0, which is just a nice way of saying, oh, it's a little more balanced approach, which more aligns probably with what you and I talk about. But it's just funny how they have to give it a new name and make it a new trend and reinvent it just so that we have something more to sell and all of the keto products out there can still sell, right? So, what is it about the keto diet that works initially, and then where are the mechanisms faltering long term?
Sure, sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a couple of mechanisms through which it works initially and can have some real benefits. The first one, which can happen on pretty much any diet, is that when we're going on to a diet, especially one that's restricting an entire macronutrient or that is just very different from the diet we're doing, we're going to cut out a lot of the quote unquote bad foods that we're already eating. Typically, we're going to be cutting out a lot of those processed foods. If we were relying really heavily on grains, wheat, pizza, pasta, bread, all those kinds of things, we're cutting those out when we go low carb or keto. And that alone is beneficial, right? We know that we would get benefits even just by cutting those things out and shifting toward a more whole food based diet. And that just, it's not necessarily the processing that is the issue. It's how these things are processed, right? If we're talking about just cutting potatoes, frying them in coconut oil and adding a little bit of salt and putting that in a bag, that's fine. But if instead we're talking about the ridiculous chemical processing that has to happen to produce canola oil or soy oil, and then we're mixing that in with the processing that goes on with grains and added vitamins and minerals, many of which are in the wrong forms, which then cause other problems. I mean, it's those are two different beasts, even though you could say they're both processed. So it's not just the processing itself; it's how are these things processed, what are the ingredients, and all of that. But so that's part one. We're taking out things that are not healthy for us. That's kind of the simplified version of it. The second one is one of the biggest drivers of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, weight gain, which of course goes hand in hand with obesity, and autoimmune conditions. So many other issues come back to the gut. So our gut health and poor gut health is really one of the main drivers for those disease processes. The reason for that is because the bacteria that are in our gut produce various toxic compounds that, when we absorb them, are basically directly poisonous to our mitochondria and prevent us from producing energy from the food coming in. They directly drive an inflammatory state and cause everything from fatty liver to plaque development and cardiovascular disease. So, the gut side of things is massive. And we see this. We see what's called metabolic endotoxemia. So one of the main toxins produced by the guts is called endotoxin. The chemical name is lipopolysaccharide. And elevated levels of lipopolysaccharide are seen in diabetes, obesity, and on from there. And it's known to be a major driver in these disease states. One of the main things that causes more production of this is if we're consuming carbohydrates that we aren't effectively digesting, and we already have bacterial imbalance, and those carbohydrates are feeding the bacteria. And that causes an increase in endotoxin production, which causes intestinal permeability. It causes leaky gut. We absorb that endotoxin, and we're seeing havoc wreaked everywhere. And so that's the second biggest one, is that we're cutting out the food or the types of foods, the category of foods that are most likely to feed those bacteria when we have a bacterial imbalance. So relief from that can be massive. I mean, you see this, you see legitimate benefits on these diets in terms of autoimmune conditions and brain fog and neurodegenerative conditions and insulin resistance. And those are real benefits, I would say, largely due to these first two things we've talked about, cutting out bad foods and not feeding the bacteria and not producing endotoxin. And they see this in studies where you can provide an antibiotic and put the rodents or mice or primates into a state that would cause fatty liver disease, but you provide the antibiotics, cut out the endotoxin, and it doesn't happen. So we know that this is a major, major driver of these disease states, and we know that that's one of the primary reasons, probably the biggest reason, why these diets provide benefit. And as I was saying, it is a true benefit. Like, it is great to have that. But as we'll get to, we can do that without the cost to our health, without the stress that's driven by the lack of carbohydrates. And that's really what we want to do. So I would say those are the two primary reasons. And then one other reason that I have to mention very briefly is that when our mitochondria are blocked, we tend to have problems metabolizing glucose. We can't convert those carbohydrates to energy. That's what we call insulin resistance. If we take out the glucose, if we take that out of the equation and just provide fat and start to produce some ketones, we aren't going to have as much of an issue. The things that tend to block energy production are more impactful on glucose metabolism. It's more sensitive to those sorts of things. So we can run on fat relatively effectively. And so in this state, we're already dealing with these metabolic issues. We can just cut the glucose out and not fix our ability to utilize it, but just avoid it. And we'll see some benefits from that too. But there is some major costs, and we're not actually fixing the underlying problem of not being able to use those carbohydrates. So that's kind of the positives we get when it comes to low carb and keto diets.
So I always talk about the fact that you don't use it, you lose it. Like if you're not going to the gym and you're going to the gym, you're only doing leg day and you're not doing arm day, you're going to have skinny arms and you're not going to use those muscles. Well, if you don't use the muscle to burn glucose for energy, your body's going to say, I don't need to learn how to do this. I don't need to know how to do this. And I've had so many friends and clients say, I've been on keto for years and I just have one meal with carbs and I blow up. And it's because your body's like, hey, wait a second, what is this? I'm not used to this. But what else is it doing long term to thyroid function, to metabolism? And then if you could touch on the liver health, because what I'm seeing is due to the spike protein, due to the toxicity, just increasing and increasing and increasing. Our livers are so backed up, they can't process the fat and the proteins like they used to. So a high fat diet might backfire even initially on somebody, and you might feel nauseous and actually gain weight from that excess fat because your liver doesn't know what to do with it. So if you could talk about some of the side effects long term of keto.
Yeah, definitely. And you brought up a great point, which is someone's on keto and then they go eat a meal with carbs. And normally it's not just eating some fruit or some white rice. It's pizza, it's donuts, things that don't just have carbs. They have a lot of fat too. But it's not normally the healthy things. And then they don't have a good response and they say, oh, it's the carbs, of course.
Right.
But even so, even if someone does maybe eat some potatoes, sweet potatoes, or fruit, they still might have some negative effects. And as you said, it's because when we're in that state, we've shifted everything toward being able to utilize fats and still absorb protein as well. But the ability to digest and absorb carbohydrates is downregulated, and the ability to convert those to energy is downregulated as well, because we've shifted all of our mitochondria, our enzymes, our hormones toward fat burning and ketone production. So when we're adding carbs in, and this is well known, if someone takes what's called an oral glucose tolerance test when they're on a low carb diet, they're going to fail miserably, meaning that their body's not going to use the glucose well and it's going to look like they have diabetes. The reality is that this is just a temporary state while you're on a low carb diet. But what that means is when you do want to add carbs in, you have to do so slowly and carefully in transition so that your body has the opportunity to make those adaptations that it needs to make. So that's a great point. But as you were saying, the bigger concern here is what's happening long term on these diets. We might have some of these notable benefits, but what are the drawbacks here? Why don't we want to go that route? And the primary one is that when we're avoiding carbohydrates and we're taking that shift over to fat as our main fuel, our bodies recognize that as another sign of scarcity, as a sign of famine, like we were talking about earlier. Our carb availability in our environment is kind of the most fickle. It's the one that changes the most. And so when we're in a really abundant environment with a lot of carbohydrates, our bodies recognize that. They drive up their metabolic state using thyroid hormone production and reproductive hormone production like testosterone and progesterone, and keeping the stress hormones down. But when we don't, and the blood sugar starts to drop due to that lack of carbohydrate, we start to produce a little bit of stress hormones. And then if we continue to not have carbohydrate, we produce more and more. And what those stress hormones do is they start to increase the production of carbohydrate from protein, from amino acids, and they start to shift us toward burning more fat. And this is the first step that we have of adapting to a lack of carbohydrates. And it's great that we can do this. It allows our body to function when there's not carbohydrates available, but there's an inherent metabolic cost. So when this happens, the stress hormones here, and there's three in particular that are most involved. There's glucagon, epinephrine or adrenaline, and cortisol. And in that process of increasing gluconeogenesis to produce carbohydrates from our amino acids, in the process of shifting us over toward burning more fat and producing more ketones, they also turn down our metabolic rate by reducing the production of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland, reducing the conversion of thyroid hormones, the inactive T4 to the active T3, which largely happens in the liver and peripheral tissues, and also turning down the production of reproductive hormones like testosterone and progesterone. Those are really the main places, the main kind of switches on a global sense where these hormones are having impacts that are going to slow down our metabolic rate. There's also some inherent effects where when the mitochondria, the engines, are using fat as a fuel instead of carbohydrates, they have to run slower unless they're driven by stress. So that's another factor that actually slows the metabolic rate as well in the long term. So all of those things together lead to slower metabolism, meaning we're eating less and less and maintaining our weight, right? We're able to maintain our weight eating less food, which is not something that we actually want. And then at the same time, the downregulation of our metabolism starts to take a toll. We start to see those downstream effects. We start to maybe have trouble falling asleep, or we start to wake up during the night, or maybe experiencing more anxiety. The cravings, of course, can get out of control at times. We might start to feel lethargic, might see the libido drop. The digestive symptoms might start to come back, maybe due to other issues, not actually due to the carb related bacteria. But as you said, maybe we're starting to have liver issues that's leading to trouble with digesting fats, for example, right? We're not having good bile flow due to all the stress that's gone on at the liver due to the lack of carbohydrates. So we start to see these things crop up. And a lot of times, those symptoms, those improvements that we might have noticed early on, they start to rear their head again. And oftentimes they're far worse. And we've, in the process, dug ourselves into this metabolic hole that then we have to dig out of. And that's not always a fun process and can be a treacherous one. But yeah, that's the kind of downstream long-term effects that we're seeing from these diets.
And not to mention the fact that it's hard to sustain this type of diet. And
Of
if
course.
you stop getting the results, then you really are not going to sustain the diet because you're going to give up and you're not going to reach for the apple. You're going to reach for the Ben and Jerry's, which is so when you're talking about carbs, people tend to not reach for those whole food carbs. They're reaching for the processed foods that are going to destroy your mitochondria and ATP and cause the brain fog, cause the quick weight gain, all the things all at once. And then you give up, you're depressed, and the wheels come off. So